True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with sand.
The Night Stalker. BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Zupansky.
Good evening. Discover the dark side of human nature with Blood on the Tracks. This true crime book takes you on a journey through the most heinous murder cases in history, including unsolved mysteries that will leave you wondering. Each story is expertly researched and crafted to provide a captivating account of the events leading up to the crime and the investigation that followed. From the infamous Thanksgiving Massacre, to the shocking case of the Vanishing Bride and Groom, to the unbelievable story of a dominatrix and her doppelgänger, Blood on the Tracks leaves no stone unturned. As you turn each page, you'll feel the tension and suspense build as you try to piece together the clues and solve the case alongside the investigators. Don't miss out on this captivating journey through the world of murder and mystery. The book that we're featuring this evening is Blood on the Tracks, Real-Life Tales of Murder and Mystery, with my special guest, journalist and author, Rod Kackley. Welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Rod Kackley.
Hi, Dan. Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for this interview, for this new edition, Blood on the Tracks. First off, in the introduction, we talked about that this true crime book takes us on a journey through the most heinous murder cases in history, including unsolved mysteries that will leave you wondering. I might seem obvious, but what was the criteria for this book, and what are just a couple of the infamous murderers that are featured?
Well, I think, Dan, what I was really looking at here are stories of murder that could happen to you, quite honestly. You brush up in this book against crimes that could happen to you or someone you love, that could happen in your neighborhood. Like with the first one we were going to talk about, the murder of Ashley Wadsworth, is the story of a young girl who goes to England to meet the man she fell in love with online. And another thing is, usually the killers in these stories, the criminals, they're first timers. Okay. These are not people, for the most part, who have killed before, or maybe have not even committed a serious crime before, certainly not a felony. We do look at others who are serial killers in this book, but they're all stories of crimes that could happen to you or someone you love.
Let's talk about the murder of Ashley Wadsworth for the very first story. Like you say, sort of not involving infamous serial killers whatsoever. And you talk about this Ashley Wadsworth from Vernon, British Columbia, Canada. And they had met when she was 12 and he was 15, and just a platonic relationship online. He lived in Essex County in England, and she lived in Vernon, BC, like I had mentioned. And so they had this online relationship. Tell us at what point this relationship changes, and as far as a trip that she is going to go and venture on to England to meet Jack Semple.
When she turned 19, Dan, Ashley got a 6-month visa to meet Jack in person. She flew from Canada to England. This happened during her gap year. And at first, it was just as amazing, as idyllic as she could have imagined. This was right out of a storybook to begin with. But then Jack, a guy who's a big guy, one of the thick-necked kind of guys, big shoulders. I mean, his shoulders are so big, you almost have to look at them one at a time, okay?
Right.
Heavily tattooed arm. She sent some pictures back online to her friends and family in Canada that showed she and Jack were having a great time. But quickly, everything goes wrong. Jack turns violent. He lashes out at Ashley. Then Ashley starts sending messages back home, writing in code, because Jack is monitoring everything she writes, everything she texts and tweets back home. He's monitoring all of it. So he's a very controlling individual now. He's become very controlling. He's psychologically, mentally, and even physically abusive toward Ashley. She's on a 6-month visa. She has no way to get home. He's got her tickets home. She can't just fly back. So she's got to live this out. She's got to get through this somehow.
She also resorts to, she had made some friends while she was on this brief trip, and now this trip was going to be cut short. She was planning to stay till April, but now she was making plans to cut this trip short, and she was going to leave February 3rd. But in the interim, she also was sending messages to friends she had met in England to warn them, to try to get them to contact police because she was afraid of Jack and afraid about this impending leaving sooner than she had planned.
Yeah, 2 days before she was going to go home on the 3rd, on the 1st, February 1st, 2022, Ashley walks to a neighbor's house, knocks at the door, and as soon as the door opens, Ashley tells the person inside that she's afraid Jack is going to kill her. The neighbor, of course, was concerned and walked Ashley back to Jack's apartment. Even though that Ashley said she was afraid Jack was going to kill her, they go back to Jack's apartment. And there, Jack assures the neighbor that he and Ashley had simply had a lover's quarrel. Everything was okay, and there was nobody, and she was not in danger at all. Well, then Ashley grabs Jack's Facebook account to send messages back home, or rather to people she'd met in England and pleading for their help. She wanted them to dial 999, the number for police assistance in England. A couple of the friends in Essex, they come to Jack's apartment to check on Ashley. They knock on the door, but the door does not open. So they call 999 for police assistance. Meanwhile, a fight breaks out in the apartment. Neighbors can hear the sounds of this horrendous fight, and they too start calling 999. Police arrive. Jack won't let them in the apartment. He refuses to even answer the door. The police officers are forced to use a battering ram to get inside.
Yeah, well, they use a battering ram, and they find Jack alive, but Ashley dead.
Ashley's dead. She's in bed, laying in the bed. Essex police talk to Jack. At the time when they broke in, they find Ashley dead. They find Jack alive. But what's Jack doing? He's on a FaceTime call to his sister, showing her the body.
Incredible.
He's showing Ashley's body on FaceTime to his sister.
Wow.
And as I wrote, it's a god-awful, bloody mess. Ashley was stabbed 90 times. The autopsy would show Ashley suffered stab wounds to her stomach, liver, lungs, and heart. Her face, neck, legs, and arms were bruised. Jack immediately, Jack offers no explanation to the police except to say, "I'm sorry, I strangled her and I stabbed her. I went psychotic."
Yeah, incredible. No explanation whatsoever. Let's talk about another extraordinary tale, the murder of Sidney Sutherland. And this is August 18th, 2020, Jackson County, Arkansas, in a place called Tuckerman. And this is Sidney. She did just come back from a little vacation, little trip, her and her family. And Sidney is a dedicated runner and decides to go for a run down this country road 41. She's a 25-year-old. And then you write about, meanwhile, a guy named Quake Lillowin is also on Jackson County Road number 41. He's 28 years old. Tell us about this intersection of these two people. They had gone to the same little high school. They sort of knew each other, but not very well. Tell us what happens that one day on Jackson County Road for 41.
Yeah, Tuckerman is one of those small towns where everybody knows a little bit about everybody else. So they knew each other. They were familiar with each other. They had been in the same high school at the same time, but they weren't really close. However, as we'll find out, Quake wanted to be a lot closer to Sidney than Sidney ever imagined him to be. Now, these two, their lives are not going on a parallel course, even though they live in the same town and they're about the same age. Quake is working for his family's business. They own rice fields, and rice fields are very big in Arkansas. His whole day involves driving around in a GMC pickup truck, checking the rice farms, his family's rice farm in Arkansas, checking the wells and the rice fields. So that's what he's doing on County Road 41. Now, Sidney is about to begin the second chapter of her life. She's just passed her boards and is now a registered nurse at Unity Harris Medical Center. So she's going off in a different path, a professional path, if you will. And she's going out for something she does every day. She's going to run on Jackson County Road 41. Now, as you said, she and her family just got back from a vacation in Florida, and they still had a car to unpack and laundry to do. Her mom, Maggie, begged Sidney not to run this day. For some reason, she said, "We've been gone. You need to rest." You just did an hour-long hard workout. She worked out with a trainer, too. She's very physically involved. But Sydney would not change her mind. She would not listen to her mom. She went out for this run because, as Sydney put it, it just releases me. So she's on County Road 41 running. Quake is on County Road 41 driving his pickup truck. While Sydney was a high school cheerleader, blonde, beautiful, Quake was one of those middle-of-the-road C student kids that doesn't attract a lot of attention, neither good nor bad. So they've got that, too. Quake's mother and father divorced. When he was young, she remarried. He is close to his stepfather, a real father figure in his life. No history of violence. That's another thing I was talking about with most of the criminals in this book I put together. He has no history of violence. One fight in junior high, but that's kind of, that could be typical. Got through high school without any serious problems. So now he and Sydney are going to intersect. Their lives will intersect County Road 41. He sees her running. He recognizes her immediately. He passes Sydney. They were Facebook friends for a while, so they know each other, but they're not close pals or anything. He turns his truck around after passing her while she's jogging on County Road 41. He drives back toward her, but then there's a cloud of dust that kicks up and he can't see Sydney anymore. She disappears. Quake feels the impact. He hits her. I don't know if you've ever hit a deer on the road, but it's quite similar to that, I guess. Quake hits Sydney with his pickup truck. He, though, is not sure what happens. Of course, he's hoping that the worst hasn't happened. He gets out of his truck to investigate, and he finds Sydney. He kneels down beside her broken body, asking if she's okay. She does not respond. Or Quake freaks out. He's out of his mind. Again, nothing like this has ever happened to him. So what's he do? Does he run to a farmhouse for help? Maybe grab his phone and call 911? No, he does not. He picks up Sydney's broken body, puts her corpse in the bed of his pickup truck, and drives off. He's not looking for medical help. He's sure the woman is dead.
Now, what happens? He's still working. He's still on his shift, so he feels compelled to continue his shift. So he finishes his shift, and then he goes home to his stepfather's house and has dinner.
No, actually, he goes to his house to have dinner. He goes to his family's home, he and his wife and her kids, who he treats as his own. Now, Quake now is hoping that if he ignores this, if he forgets about it, it will be like it never happened. Okay? So he takes the body, and as we write in the book, he undresses the corpse and messes around with it before burying it in a shallow grave. But now he's hoping that if he can forget about all this, that it will never have happened. Okay? So he goes home like nothing special is going on. He sits down with his wife and stepkids at his parents' home, and where he does live with his parents and his step-parents, as you said, and cleans up, takes a shower, has dinner, and then after they finish, his father calls. His father says, everybody's talking about Sydney Sutherland. She's disappeared. Have you seen her? Have you heard she was missing? Did you know that she disappeared? And Quake says, I have not heard the stories, but I did see Sydney running on County Road 41. It looked like she was going home. After that, he goes to bed. Again, his plan is that he's going to pretend that this didn't happen.
Now, you write that Quake, meanwhile, Sydney's boyfriend calls Sydney's mother, Maggie, and he's concerned that she's not returning his calls. And Maggie calls Sydney, and there's a voicemail. And the mother knows that something is wrong. Around 7 p.m., she calls police. And you write that news of the disappearance spreads quickly across northeast Arkansas, and detectives start investigating. Tell us about how the parents get involved in doubting their son in the first place, and how that leads to the word getting out that he had actually seen Sydney that day running, and which led to more and more questions.
Yeah, there is, as you said, no sign of Sydney. This is August 20th now. Sam, her boyfriend, gets a call from a friend who tells him that Quake might know something. The friend says Quake told him he saw Sydney running south on County Road 41 2 days ago, like she was heading home. And if that's true, it means Quake was the last one to see Sydney alive, or last one to see Sydney. Nobody now knows she's dead yet, except for Quake. They go out, the troopers go out to the field to search. They find Sydney's phone in a field about a mile from the Sutherland family home. Unfortunately, that's the only good news today. A ground search shows nothing. They've exhausted all of their leads. Well, Maggie and her friends turn out, hundreds of people actually turn out to search for Sydney. They find nothing, but you know what happens when they're searching? Maggie looks over and sees Quake standing by a tree. Maggie knows something's off. It's like he's lurking there. She goes over to talk to him and she knows that Sam's friend said that Quake might have been the last person to see Sydney the day she disappeared. And Maggie asks Quake if she can tell him, or if he can tell her anything. Like, what was Sydney doing? Did you meet anybody? Was she with anyone? Quake said, no, she was just running. But you did see her, right? Maggie says. And Quake doesn't speak, but he just nods to indicate the answer is yes. And he just says all she was doing was running. But then Maggie can't think of anything else to say. But at the same time, she doesn't believe Quake is telling her the truth. She's about to ask one more question. Quake steps forward. Now, Quake is a very big guy, all right? He's like well over 6 feet tall. He's like 300 pounds. He's a big dude. He walks up and gives Maggie a hug. It's not like a full embrace. It's just like a quick, embarrassed squeeze, like two strangers, perhaps, or two people who haven't seen each other in a long time.
Right.
And that really flips Maggie out. She just like is shivering as Quake walks away. She just knows something is going on here involving Quake. Now, Quake's father, as you said, his father gets suspicious because he knows Quake was driving on the road where Sydney was last seen. And again, he asks Quake if he knows anything about what happened. And Quake's mother is suspicious too. So the first thing they do is Quake and his father go to the Arkansas State Police Post to talk to detectives there, and they give troopers permission to search the truck. They have no lawyer now. They just give him permission, the troopers rather, permission to search the truck. Both Quake's father and mother are suspicious at this time, as you said.
The forensic team goes to work. He gives permission to search the vehicle. So, what do they find, the forensic team, when they search that vehicle?
They find blood in the cracks of the truck's tailgate, and they find a dent in the front of the 2019 GMC pickup truck. The blood in the tailgate, that's where he put her body. That's where he put Sydney's body after he picked her up off the road. So that's where the blood comes from. And the dent obviously makes them suspicious as well. And then Preston Hutton, who's a senior special agent on this from the Arkansas State Police, he takes a look at Quake's phone and Quake hands it over to him. Again, no lawyer present.
Right.
That's another thing in this book. You'll find that a lot of the criminals in this, they don't have lawyers with them. Hutton taps the Life 360 phone app on Quake's phone. He traces Quake's movements on the 19th. And that shows that he and Sydney were very close together, according to what Sydney's phone showed.
There's also, the app leads them very close to the point, a few yards from where they'll find her corpse buried in the field. But at this shallow grave site, troopers see footprints from the same kinds of boots that he would wear at work and that he was wearing at the time.
Yeah, right, exactly. He's actually wearing the same boots still. So again, he's obviously not a hardened criminal who knows how to beat the system. They read him as Miranda rights. The app leads them to just a few yards from where they will find Sydney's corpse eventually buried in the field. They read him as Miranda rights. He can't handle the guilt. He confesses it all. He says it was all just a blur. I didn't kill her on purpose. He's asked, why didn't you call 911? And Quaid says, that I don't know. I was just scared.
You have the idea, too, that at the same time, Sam and Maggie worrying about their daughter in a group of searchers searching for their daughter. Sam gets a call from Sheriff Lucas, doesn't he?
Yes, Sheriff Lucas calls with one of the toughest calls he's ever had to make. As you said, Maggie, Sam, and hundreds of people, they're back on County Road 41 this morning. They're on their hands and knees, literally crawling, looking for clues that might show that Sydney was at least there. One of the women there, one of the friends, explains the hundreds of people who showed up by saying, Jackson County is just this way. We just want her to be safe, referring to Sydney, of course, and to be found. And finally, Maggie shouts, I have a bead from a necklace. She finds a bead from the necklace that she knows Sydney was wearing, so she knows Sydney had been in that area. But then, as you said, Sheriff Lucas calls Sam's phone, and Lucas won't tell him why they need to talk. He just says, Sam, you and Maggie, the whole family, please get everyone together. We need to talk. So there they have to get into Sam's car, and they drive to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, which had to be the longest, most difficult drive of Sam's life.
Yes.
He knows in his heart what they're going to hear. There's only one reason that Sheriff Lucas would be calling them. If he'd found Sydney alive, he would have shouted that over the phone. But he didn't. So they know They know what Sheriff Lucas is going to tell them, but they have to drive to his office to hear it. And there, Sheriff Lucas does perform the sad duty of explaining that Sidney has been found dead.
He does psych evaluation, but he's found, fortunately, fit to stand trial. And then he is, as you write, he is sentenced to life in prison without parole. And he said he will die in prison.
Right, essentially, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you write about the victim statements. An overpass on US 67 in Jackson County will be named in honor of Sidney Sutherland.
Yeah, that's what local officials decided to do. It's a very emotional ceremony when they announce it. And Maggie at the time says, well, at least she will never be forgotten. We know that she will never be forgotten because of the plaque that they're going to put up on that road.
Let's use this, Rod, as an opportunity to stop for a second for these messages. Now, let's get to this next story, and it's Thanksgiving Massacre. And you write this in an interesting style where you have an exciting, vivid scene right at the very beginning, and you say this is how the story ended. And this is 9 a.m., just after 9 a.m., July 15th, 2010. Tell us about this tractor-trailer rig and what it's doing and who's inside.
Tractor-trailer rig, yeah. Now, I will tell you, Dan, before we really get going here, this was a story that was very personal to me. I didn't know any of the people involved, but I lived in the area where this happened, Muskegon, Michigan, where the murder happened. So I was there, kind of watching it from afar the whole time. Now, here it's 2010, July 15th, 9 o'clock in the morning, like you said. A tractor-trailer rig, big and powerful as they come, is racing toward the razor wire top double chain link fence that's surrounding the Kinross Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. 3 convicted killers are inside that truck. They hijacked this truck and they're hurtling toward the fence, a desperate bid for freedom. They commandeered the rig, they overpowered the truck's driver, got behind the wheel, rammed through the gears, and put the pedal down to the metal. This is like something you'd see in a high-octane action-adventure movie, but it really happened in the Upper Peninsula on this morning, July 15th, 2010. Prisoners, these guys are all in for life. They are going to spend the rest of their life in prison, so what do they have to lose? They have the weapons, the guards' weapons that they took, and the truck hits the fence after about 100 yards and gets wrapped up in the chain link fence, comes to a screeching halt. The convicts inside do everything they can to bust the truck out of the fencing, but it's no use. They run for it. 2 of them, Brian Davison, convicted of beating a man to death, and Andrew Ross, who killed his parents and older brother, are quickly captured. But the third, Seth Pravaki, who the story is really about, he's shot in the head and dies almost instantly. Ironic, I write, because Seth admitted to killing 4 members of his family and his brother's girlfriend by shooting each of them one after another in the head. And that's how the story ends.
And then you write, this is how the story begins. And you go to the last day of Thanksgiving weekend, November 29th, 1998. And you write that Seth Pravaki is angry. He's 18 years old and he's been arguing with his father. And you say, in fact, his father, Stephen, who teaches 5th grade, threatens to kick Seth out of the family home in Dalton Township near Muskegon, Michigan. And he's 6'4", and his parents described him as a good kid. But he's been some trouble lately. He's been using drugs, booze, weed, LSD, and then speed. And then he starts selling drugs. Tell us about this Thanksgiving Day that everything goes wrong.
Yeah, it's the last day of Thanksgiving weekend. He has been fighting with his father. His dad's threatened to kick him out of the house. I mean, he is a very troubled kid, as you say. One time he broke the family's dishwasher by standing on it. He's a big guy, 6'4". He's been a real problem for the family. But now they're going to have a late Thanksgiving dinner. It's the last day of the holiday. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, they're getting ready. The whole family's coming over. Now, Seth has been caught shoplifting. He has had trouble, okay, so let's get that in there too. But his mother, Linda, who's a receptionist at a medical office, is showering. His father, Stephen, is out of the house. Stephen went to pick up his father, Seth's grandfather, John Pravaki, and brought him to bring him back to the house for the celebration. Seth's 19-year-old brother, Jedediah, is in the basement watching TV, waiting for his girlfriend, April Boss, to arrive. That's the family scene. Everybody's getting ready for this late Thanksgiving dinner. Obviously, no one has any idea of what's going to happen. Well, while Jedediah is in the basement watching the television, Seth walks up behind him, carrying their father's loaded .22 Ruger. He points the gun at the back of Jedediah's head, pulls the trigger, killing his brother instantly. Then Seth hears his father's car pulling up in the driveway. He waits with that Ruger. As John and Stephen Pravaki walk from the driveway to the house, Seth opens fire, killing both men. He even shoots John twice to make sure his grandfather is really dead. Now, Linda, while this is happening, Linda's still upstairs in the shower. Seth hears her turn off the water. So he goes up to the hallway outside the bathroom door. As soon as his mom walks out of the bathroom, he shoots her dead too. That's it. The family's gone. But then Seth hears the front door opening and then closing. Who could that be? It's April. April Boss, his brother's girlfriend. Seth decides there can be no witnesses, and he shoots her dead too. Now, he's an 18-year-old who has a history of minor, like shoplifting, that kind of thing. All of a sudden, he's a guy who's faced with the problem of what do you do with 5 corpses?
So what does he do? You say that he calls his best friend, Stephen Wallace.
Yeah, he calls his best friend, Stephen, and says, hey, I've done it, and I need your help. What's Stephen do? He goes over to the Pravaki home as soon as he can. Seth tells Stephen they have to get the bodies out of the house. They go to work. But then they realize how heavy a dead body is, and they've got 5 of them. 5 dead bodies to move. Moving all 5, Seth realizes it's going to be next to impossible, so he comes up with a new plan. Seth decides they need to make it look like a robbery that went wrong. But since all 5 were shot in the head at near point-blank range, Seth decides he needs to get some duct tape to make it look like they were all bound, gagged, and then executed. So he drives out to the grocery store to get the tape. First, though, he picks up some spent shell casings off the floor, and on his way to the store, Seth tosses the shell casings into a gas station garbage can. Stephen, meanwhile, drives 10 miles down the road to a pond and tosses the gun and the clip Seth used to kill his family into the water. Now, after taking care of that crime-hiding business, what does Stephen do? He goes to a Blockbuster video store and returns a movie that he rented a few days earlier. And then, and only then, Stephen goes to a church youth group meeting.
Yes.
After a few hours, they get back to the Pravaki abode, now a house of death, and it's time to move the bodies into position after liberally applying duct tape to the corpses. Seth decides that if it was a robbery and 5 people paid for it with their lives, something of value has to be disappeared. It has to be a robbery, right? So he takes one of the family's television sets outside and puts it in a car, and they're going to drive it away somewhere so that a TV will be gone. Now, they're working on the bodies inside the house, and one of them decides to go outside to deal with the body of Seth's father, which is still lying dead in the driveway.
Wow.
It's about midnight now. Remember, this all started about 1:30 in the afternoon, and it's pretty close to 11 hours later now. Now, at this moment, Julie Cooper and her husband, Tom, pull into the Pravaki's driveway. They're looking for Julie's daughter, April. April Boss, the girlfriend who failed to show up for her 3rd shift job. And Julie, as she and Tom pull into the driveway, they see a tall man leaning over what looks like a dead person's body. Their eyes meet, Julie and the man, and he runs off. Well, her heart's in her throat. Julie calls 911. She tells the dispatcher she thinks she's found a dead body. She also tells the dispatcher that she's really worried because my daughter's car is here. Well, first things first, Julie, the dispatcher says, how do you know he's dead, this person? How do you know this person is dead? And Julie sobs because he's filled with blood. He's cold and he's not moving. She tells the police they need to look for a tall man with a plaid shirt and light-colored pants. They say he also dropped a flashlight. Now, Julie and Tom do not wait for the police because they're worried about April. They go into the house, they turn the lights on, and they spot a trail of blood going through the house and the garage. They're still on the phone with the dispatcher, Julie is. They walk through the house. Now they stop. They know that blood is there. The sheriffs are on the way. The deputies are on the way. Flashing lights and sirens. Now, this is a very rural area. Okay, we're out in the country now. So lights and sirens is unusual. It's not like you're in a city where you kind of hear police all the time. Now, this wakes up everybody in Muskegon County. The sheriff's deputies turn out in force. They go inside the house, and they find the bodies. 5 bodies scattered. Well, there's 5. There's Jess, the grandfather's outside, but the other 4 are inside. Blood is splashed and sprayed everywhere. The county prosecutor, Tony Tagg, says it's the most serious and vicious attack on a household that he has ever witnessed. Tony Tagg is a very interesting guy, too. We used to call him TV Tony because he loved to be interviewed on TV. Did any of the dead ever have a chance? No, they did not. There are no signs that any of the dead struggled or fought to live. Tony says each of the killings resulted from a brutal execution-style death, and he says the shooting occurred with a definite plan of shooting all 5. Well, now they're looking for Seth because he's missing. They're also looking for Stephen Wallace, and they catch up with him rather quickly. They find him walking out of the woods, and he says that he has a story to tell them, and then he proceeds to tell the deputies what Seth has done. Now, they found him in the woods outside the house. And that triggers a manhunt like Muskegon County has never seen before. Again, this is a rural area, relatively low crime rate outside of the city of Muskegon.
Right.
Seth stayed on the run for 13 hours before they finally got him.
You say that at first he blames Jebediah, but quickly he caves in and confesses, doesn't he?
Yeah, right. Again, this is someone who's not used to dealing with the police on something as serious as this. And he did try to blame Jedidiah, but then he finally did confess and claims his father never had a good thing to say about him, and his brother and mother had turned against him too. So he just went ballistic and started killing the family. That's the way he explained it.
Yes, he was sentenced to 5 counts of life without parole. But the interesting thing is Stephen was charged as an accessory after the fact, but acquitted by a jury in 1999. And this sounds familiar. The only reason he did it because he feared for his life.
Yeah, but that's right. Said he feared for his life. But then again, he had plenty of opportunities to get out of this. I mean, he goes to return a tape. He goes to a youth group. He could have talked to the cops anytime, but he didn't. He came back.
Certainly. Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second to hear from our sponsor. There is no perfect diet, and it's virtually impossible to get all the required nutrients you need from your diet, and so Ritual can help fill the gaps. Ritual has made a multivitamin that helps you focus on what's important, filling key nutrient gaps to support your foundational health. My wife Lisa and I decided to try Ritual Essential for Women 18 plus and then Ritual for Men 50 plus after reading about the important research they undertook to develop their multivitamin in the first place. A clinically backed multivitamin for women 18 plus with high quality and traceable key ingredients in clean, bioavailable forms. Rituals Essential for Women 18 plus is one of the few women's multis that's USP verified, meaning what's on the label is what's in the formula. It's also soy-free, gluten-free, vegan-friendly, and formulated without GMOs. Instead of striving for perfect health, aim for supporting foundational health. Great news! Ritual is offering my listeners 10% off during your first 3 months. Visit ritual.com/murder to start Ritual or add Essential for Women 18 plus to your subscription today. Now, the next story that we are focusing on is The Torso Killer Confesses. And this starts off in February 15, 1968, this story with a woman named Diane Cusick. And she was going to the Green Acres Mall in Nassau County, New York, to buy dancing shoes. Hours later, her parents were concerned she hadn't come home. So they drove to the mall. Can you take it from there? What happened?
Yeah, they drove to the mall. They drove to the shopping center, and they found Diane's Plymouth Valiant in the mall's parking lot. Fearing the worst, they look inside the vehicle, and they make a horrifying discovery. They see their daughter's body. Her corpse is in the backseat of the car. An adhesive band is over her mouth, and her hands are tied together. Diane had been strangled to death. She was pronounced deceased at 1:40 a.m. on February 16th, 1968. And this is not the story of the kind of guy you never would think would do anything like this. This is the story of one of America's most prolific serial killers, Richard Cottingham. He confessed in 2022 that he killed Diane back in 1968, and he also admitted to killing 4 other women.
You write that Cottingham is now 76 years old and he's in poor health. So this is almost like a deathbed confession, at least for people trying to get information from him.
Yeah, exactly. And now he would become known as the Torso Killer because of the gruesome way he butchered the victims' bodies. He started killing young women and girls in 1967, he said, and he didn't stop until 1980. So far, police say he slaughtered at least 17 in New York and New Jersey. And that's only the ones that the cops know about. Cottingham has bragged in 2009 that he committed at least 80 murders and maybe as many as 100, as he put it, perfect murders across the USA. and all of the victims female. In 2014, Cottingham started confessing, or maybe he was bragging. As he said, it's kind of like a deathbed confession. But then again, I'm thinking maybe he just wants a chance to have one more walk in the limelight, as he sees it. Maybe he's bragging, whatever. He told the New Jersey Bergen County Prosecutor's Office that he killed 3 teenage girls between 68 and 69, in addition to the people that he had already said he killed. One was a girl by the name of Jackie Harp, only 13 years old, when he ambushed the child as she walked home from school band practice. She was strangled to death with the leather strap of her school bag. Another girl, Irene Blaze, 18, vanished on April 7th. Her body was discovered face down in 4 feet of water near the Saddle River, near Hackensack, New Jersey. She, too, had been strangled to death, possibly with the chain of her crucifix.
Wow.
And then there was Denise Velasca, a 15-year-old girl abducted in Emerson, New Jersey on July 14, 1969. The next day, she was found in Saddlebrook, New Jersey, beside a road next to a cemetery. She'd been strangled to death with a cord, or the medical examiner said, perhaps the chain of her crucifix. So then, on December 5, 2022, Cottingham again begins talking about murders. In addition to the case of Diane Cusick that we already talked about, he confessed to killing 21-year-old Mary Beth Hines. She disappeared in 1972. The 21-year-old found face down in a muddy stream. She, too, had been strangled to death. Cottingham's confession, her sister Janine told reporters, honestly, I never imagined her case would be resolved. And then he just kept talking about other women that he killed. I mean, the guy, a deathbed confession, I don't know. But he just kept talking about women that he had killed.
It's interesting you say there's those various women on December 15th. Mary Beth Hines included Laverne Moy, Rita Neves, 18 years old, and also the Sheila Hyman, 33-year-old. And what was interesting, of course, unfortunately, is their husband was suspected all along. He never found out about her fate, and he died being a suspect.
Yeah, that was really tragic. Yeah. Cottingham confessed to killing 33-year-old Sheila Hyman, who was found beaten to death. And as he said, the father was the leading suspect in this. He died in 2004 without finding out who killed Sheila or having his name cleared.
The police estimated how many victims, regardless of the confession?
Yeah, regardless of the confession, the police were talking about at least 17 in New York and New Jersey. And that's how many they know about. They're sure that he killed at least 17.
And what is the status of their investigation as a result of these confessions?
They are still, they are investigating them. They're moving forward with the investigations to see if they can confirm his confession.
Let's talk about another incredible tale. You're ramped up the graphic nature here, but this is the Kansas City butcher, Bob Burdella. He lived near Kansas City, Missouri, and he ran a curio shop in the early 80s, and was called Bob's Bazaar. And he led the neighborhood watch groups, and he was known as a pretty good guy and was not known as any kind of trouble in the community whatsoever. And then some male prostitutes began dying.
Yeah, he patronized male prostitutes. This again is in the early 80s, and everybody liked Bob. He represented the South Hyde Park neighborhood groups at fundraising events. He was on their local public TV station raising money for the neighborhood. But what was going on behind the scenes was a totally different story. But nobody really knows yet what flipped his switch and turned him into a serial killer who became known as the Kansas City Butcher. It might have been, he says, now Bob said it was a movie he saw called The Collector from 1965. The story of a young Englishman who stalks a co-ed before kidnapping the girl and keeping her in a farmhouse basement. He said that inspired him, actually, that he got his start by watching that movie.
It's interesting that a lot of serial killers have actually cited the book and the movie, The Collector, as inspiration. And many years ago, I found that book in a used bookstore, and then I recently watched that movie to see what all this inspiration was. It's quite an innocent book and an innocent movie as compared to some of the fantasies that end up these serial killers' legacies.
Yeah, and Bob's, the way Bob went, his first victim was a guy by the name of Jerry Howell, who died in 1984. Bob drugged and sodomized him. He didn't just abduct and murder people. He held them as prisoners for up to 6 weeks, torturing them every day until he finally either allowed them to die or he killed them. And Jerry Howell was the perfect example. Bob tied him to his bed for more than a day, 28 hours to be exact. Finally, Jerry gagged to death in his own vomit, or maybe the drugs that Bob gave him. Then he chopped up Jerry's body, dumped the parts and pieces in a plastic bag, and left it out at the curb for the garbage man to cart away.
You talk about the next victim, Robert Sheldon, and he was in this torture. He was blinded by drain killer, and he was kept sedated and captive for 3 days. So it's not just 1 day, now it's 3 days, and inserted needles under his fingertips and filled his ears with caulking, and then eventually cut his head off and buried it in the backyard.
Yeah, you can see that, as they say with a lot of serial killers, he just keeps stepping up, going up and up and up. The next one was Mark Wallace. He was the next to die. And then in the fall, a guy by the name of James Ferris fell victim to Bob. Todd Stoops was a 23-year-old male prostitute. Bob picked him up, tortured him for weeks before Todd died of blood loss. Mm-hmm. And then Bob went quiet, as far as we can tell, for a couple of years. Then his next victim was Larry Pearson. He was tortured for 6 long weeks. Finally, Bob put a plastic bag over Larry's head and suffocated him. And like the others, all of this, he chopped up Larry's body, and most of the corpse was left at the curb for a garbage truck to take away. But Bob took Larry's head to his backyard, buried it, and unearthed Robert Sheldon's skull, which he had also buried, and carried that, Robert Sheldon's head, into his house and set the skull up on display.
Let's use this opportunity to stop for a second for these messages. Now, you talked about took Robert Sheldon's skull and set it up on display. Who was his next victim, and how long did he torture that person for?
He tortured Chris Bryson, his next victim, a 22-year-old guy. He tortured him for days after smashing him over the head and drugging him. It was just days. But then now remember, Bob's still running his shop, the Bazaar. He's still running that every day too. His normal life is continuing while all of this goes on, and these guys are tied and tortured. Chris finds a match. He lights it and uses it to burn through his ropes. Then he's naked, except for a dog collar around his neck. He jumps out of a second-story window and hits the ground naked, running for his life. A gas meter guy or a gas company guy, a utility employee, is reading the neighborhood gas meters. He spots Chris, calls the police, and the rest is serial killer history.
You write that Bob makes it easy for the cops, relatively. Inside the house, they discover the 2 skulls and human teeth and vertebrae. And they found dozens of photos, syringes, and even notebooks in which Bob detailed how he tortured and killed his victims. He agreed to a full confession instead of the death penalty. And you say that he had a heart attack and died in prison October 1992. And one of the victims' family members said that he didn't suffer long enough.
Yeah, that she said, yeah. And you can understand how she'd feel.
Absolutely. Let's talk about a couple short stories involving real infamous murderers. You have one called To Kill a Serial Killer, and also Dead Man Riding. Let's talk about Dead Man Riding involving a person people might know, Randy Kraft.
Yeah, I kind of picked this. I took it. It's a snippet out of the whole story.
Right.
And I just found it fascinating. Here was a guy who, again, we're talking about a serial killer here. We're talking about a serial killer who for years had gotten away with his crimes. But then he makes a mistake that I can't believe. A couple of cops, we're in Los Angeles now, Mission Viejo in the Los Angeles area. 2 cops by the name of Michael Sterling and Mike Howard, an officer and a sergeant respectively, are on the San Diego freeway. And they spot a car driving erratically, must be a drunk driver. They pull it over and they find a dead guy in the passenger seat.
And what's the state of this person?
He's dead. Well, Randy, of course, is out of the car. He's the driver of this Toyota. They're doing a sobriety test on him, a field sobriety test on one of the cops. The other cop walks around to the passenger side to see what's wrong with this guy in the passenger seat. His jeans are open. He's hanging out. And the cop figures right away, this is more than a drunk driving stop, a lot more. He grasps the man's cold wrist, nothing. cold, no pulse at all, but there are welts, red stripes, angry red stripes on the wrist. So and he puts his finger on the guy's neck, nothing, no signs of life. He knows he's got a dead body in the front seat. He knows something, if that wasn't weird enough, there's something even weirder going on because his pants are open and down. And, they go from there. They find a dead man writing, 25-year-old Marine by the name of Terry Lee Gambrel. Inside the Celica, the Toyota, they find a belt which matches the bruising around his neck. They find booze, tranquilizers, a variety of prescription drugs and stimulants. And the passenger seat and the carpet are soaked with blood. And just like the last case we had, the Kansas City butcher, they find an envelope of photo, more than 50 snapshots of Randy Kraft's victims, along with notes, where he rated each of the victims and rated the way that he killed each one.
Wow, incredible. Let's talk about another short story, To Kill a Serial Killer. And who does this involve? And again, it's another snippet of a much bigger story.
Yeah, this involves a girl by the name of Rhonda Louise Williams. She's 15 years old, and she's off with a friend, somebody she thought was a friend, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Hemley. Now, he's hooked up with the serial killer that everybody knows about, Dean Arnold Corll. From 1970 through August 1973, Dean Arnold Corll raped, tortured, and murdered more than 24 boys and young men in Houston and Pasadena, Texas. Elmer Wayne Henley would bring victims to him. But in the case of Rhonda Louise Williams, Elmer Wayne Henley couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't take it anymore. So they had a girl and they had another guy, a 13-year-old pizza delivery man. A kid showed up with a pizza, and they had these two trapped, and they were going to, Corll's idea was they're going to torture and kill both of them. But Wayne Henley decided he had had enough. He takes Corll's gun, holds the gun on Corll. Corll says, "You will never shoot me." But Henley did exactly that. He shot him in the stomach and in the shoulder with a .22 caliber pistol. And that's how the murder spree of Corll ended, was with a gun held by one of his longtime accomplices.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary end to a story that because Elmer Wayne Hemley had brought Rhonda Louise Williams around, that's what enraged Dean Arnold Corll so much, so that he would put in jeopardy Elmer Wayne Hemley, his assistant. But like as you say, Elmer decided that enough was enough, and this was the end. Yeah,
he was. And now, but Henley was sentenced to life in prison. Corll was killed. He killed him right there. The police found him naked and dead.
Yeah.
But then he did Henley and the other accomplice, Brooks, were both sentenced to life in prison because it helped him commit several abductions, rapes, and murders.
Well, absolutely. Some of the other stories that are involved in this book, tell us just the outline of some of the other stories that populate this collection, Blood on the Tracks.
Yeah, we have, for instance, Murder on Del Rio Drive. This is the story of a woman who finds out that her stepfather had taken pictures of her and her friends naked for years and had kept them. And finally, she decides she can't take it anymore. She brings him home from an alcohol rehab center, kills him, and leaves his body out on the sidewalk on Del Rio Drive, covers it with garbage, and then drives away. That's in Murder by Design. Then we have Murder on Del Rio Drive, another case of just normal people who snap. But I've also included, along with murders in this book, some cases of the murder of Gay Gibson is the story that goes back a number of decades. And she was an actress who, in 1947, she was on a cruise liner going from South Africa to England. She meets up with one of the workers on the ship, and who really takes delight in having sex with a woman on every single cruise he goes on.
Right.
A deck steward by the name of James Cam. She dies while they're having sex, and rather than reporting it, he pushes her body out a porthole window into the water. So her body was never discovered. And I do include a number of stories in this book about people, usually women, who have disappeared, and we have no idea what happened to them. Now, in that case of Gay Gibson, James Cam was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to death. But then, before he was ready to die, Great Britain decided to do away with the death penalty, no more capital punishment. So he got out in like 11 years. And even Winston Churchill spoke on that. He thought that was terribly bad. But I also include stories about people who have disappeared, the Vanishing Honeymooners, a couple who back in the 20s decided to go down the Colorado River and set a speed record. Their raft, they vanished. Nobody knows what's happened to them. That's a rather famous story, too. We've got the gangster who got away, a Chicago gangster who just couldn't be put down until he died in bed, a vigilante mom who decided to kill the man who molested and killed her daughter in court. She pulled a gun and killed him in court. So there are a lot of awfully different stories here that some you may have never seen before, like trench warfare with some bank robbers who had been trained in World War I, and they used their combat abilities learned in World War I to rob a bank and several banks. So it's an interesting book, I think.
Absolutely. I want to thank you very much, Rod Kackley, for coming on and talking about your latest, Blood on the Tracks, real-life tales of murder and mystery. For those that might want to take a look at your other work, what would you recommend? Website, Amazon, social media?
Yeah, Amazon is probably the best place to go. They do a great job of putting all the books up there, including another new book I have out called The Deadly Duo, A Tale of Crime and Chaos. And this one's fiction, pure fiction. But I think you might like that one too. But yeah, Amazon is a real good place to go. Just put my name in, Rod Kackley, or you can go to my website at rodkackley.com and look me up there too.
Thank you so much, Rod Kackley. Blood on the Tracks, real life tales of murder and mystery. Thank you very much for this interview.